It gives me great pleasure in introducing and welcoming Associate Professor Cath Ellis this afternoon to our conversation, which I'm sure is going to be quite vigorous. So Cath Ellis is Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture at the University of New South Wales. Previously, she worked at the University of Huddersfield in Yorkshire, England, and the University of Wollongong in Australia, of course. While her background is in Australian and post-colonial literature, her current research is in the area of academic integrity, with a particular interest in contract cheating. Cath Ellis has been recognised for her research, bringing attention to this issue of contract cheating in universities, which I understand is rife. So a quick definition of contract cheating, just to put us in the frame. This occurs when a student employs or uses another person to produce a piece of work for them, and which they then submit as their own work. This is an epidemic afflicting universities. So Cath will bring to our awareness in her presentation the existence and activities of academic custom writing websites, how these sites operate, and inform us of future strategies to detect and defer contract. So thank you, Cath.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Christine and Hilary, for the invitation to join you here today. It's a great honour and a privilege to be addressing you today. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm located today, which is the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation. It's a very windy Bedegal day today. I'm discovering the delights of a crossbreed in an apartment when it's a windy day. I extend that respect to any people from First Nations who are joining us here today, and acknowledge that the sovereignty of their land has never been ceded. So thank you very much for having me today. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time just sharing with you some of my reflections, but also some of the findings from a research project that I've been undertaking since 2014. And I'll share with you in a little bit where that all started. But to get things started, I'm going to just share some slides with you. So if we go back up to the top here. I'm going to acknowledge and admit to you all that I cheat. I cheat on a regular basis. Every Saturday afternoon, I cheat on the cryptic crossword. And I've asked people that know me never to tell my parents this, because they'd be absolutely devastated just how much cheating goes on in my cryptic crossword life. I don't know how many of you are also cryptic crossworders.
Yes.
Good for you, Monica. It's a very important part of my life. It's one of the ways that I learned to relax when I was doing my PhD. But I cheat. And I think that doing cryptic, I think, Monica, you'll agree with me that cryptic crosswords are much easier if two or more people are doing them together. But sometimes doing them on your own, you can get a bit stuck, can't you? And there's two main ways that I cheat. I won't share those with you because it kind of might ruin the cryptic crossword. Oh, Monica, sorry, I'm letting you down. Sometimes I get to a crossword and it gets a bit like this. I get a bit stuck. And the only way I can get myself unstuck is to do some cheating. Okay, I'll share it with you, Monica. I use some anagram solvers, and I also use some crossword solvers. I guess one of the things to this, though, that I want to sort of start by giving you all this admission, is to ask you all the question, does it matter that I cheat on cryptic crosswords? And is it doing any harm? And I think that that's one thing we have to stop and think about when we're talking about academic integrity and academic misconduct and cheating and cheats. We all need to stop and have a think about our own behaviours and where we do and don't decide to cheat. One of the things I spend a lot of time doing is talking to my colleagues and my students about ethics and morals relating to cheating behaviours. And one of the things I often emphasise is the way that integrity operates in our lives in this kind of Venn diagram. of what I would call obviously academic integrity, but that overlaps also with our professional integrity, which also overlaps with our personal integrity. And here's a really fantastic example that I love to share about where these sorts of things can crash together and collide. And my apologies to any of you who might know Dr. Owie, but this is a story that was in the paper in mid-2016. Michael Owie, who was a member of the Australian Golf Club just down the road here in Sydney, and he was caught cheating while playing golf. He threw his ball a couple of metres to get a better lie and was caught doing that in a competition and was expelled from the Australian Golf Club as a result of doing that. Now, Dr. Owie was, and still is, a sports physiologist who works particularly with helping people recover from injuries sustained while playing golf, or that's limiting people's ability to play golf. So his relationship with his profession and his personal pursuit of golf were closely connected. Now, when he was expelled from the Australian Golf Club, he decided to take the golf club to court, and he engaged a solicitor who took it to court, and he tried to sue or overturn at least his expulsion from the Australian Golf Club. But the magistrate in that particular courtroom said, no, the Australian Golf Club has its rules and you need to abide by those rules if you want to maintain your membership of that community, and they have the right to expel you from their community if you don't abide by their rules. And I think it's a really interesting story about how professional and personal integrity can collide. But one of the things that was really interesting about this story when I was talking it through with my partner, who's a lawyer, was the thing that he saw that I hadn't seen was the professional integrity of the lawyer who took his case and advised him that it was a wise thing to take this matter to court, because it was by taking it to court that it got this press coverage, and really his professional practice as a sports physiologist was ruined. He could no longer practice his trade, his profession as a sports physiologist, because it became so widely known in Sydney, particularly amongst the golfing fraternity, that he had cheated at golf. So the thing that really struck me about that was that my partner was able to see the problems with the professional integrity of the solicitor who took the case. And he, my partner's view on it was, well, he shouldn't have taken the case. He should have advised Dr. Owie to, that it wasn't likely to succeed in court, that he wasn't going to take his fees, and that he'd better let it rest. So it's a really interesting example to my mind about how all of those different layers of personal and professional integrity can all kind of compound and tangle up with each other. In the end, all that Dr. Owie did was move a golf ball a couple of metres. But the result of it was that he lost his profession, he lost his income, he lost his membership of the golf club, and he's now, was the laughing stock of Sydney in the pages of the Sydney Morning Herald for several weeks. It's a lot, it's a big price to pay for moving a golf ball a metre or two. So what I want to do now is take you back in time a couple of years earlier to this, and I don't know how many of you remember this quite bold splashed headline on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. It was November the 12th, 2014, and I remember distinctly I was on leave. I was up the beach, up at Bluey's Beach with my partner on a holiday, and we were taking it in turns to go down to the local little shop and get the paper. And it was his turn to get the paper, and he came back and he put it on the dining room table and he said, Cath, I think you're going to want to read the front page of the paper. And I looked at it and I thought, oh yeah, we all know this is going on, but there's nothing we can do about it. But little did I know that this was really the starting pistol for a long race or run that I was going to be undertaking for all of the time since. I quickly logged on to my iPad version of the Sydney Morning Herald app, and I noticed that UNSW was 5th in this particular league table in terms of the number of papers that had been included in this tranche of documents that had been found by the journalists Amy McNeilage and Lisa Vizentin at the Sydney Morning Herald. I tapped and clicked to see the courses, and I found that some of them were in my faculty. Sociology, gender studies, history, and media were all in my faculty. And lo and behold, I started investigating them. That led me on down a rabbit hole, I guess is the terminology we would use now. And basically what happened with those two journalists, this was the website in question, the My Master website, and it's Sydney Morning Herald blurred out the images on the stock photo, not me, but needless to say, the website quickly went dark. But it's a reminder that the website itself was actually in Chinese, and so it's little surprise that all of the students who were caught up in this particular scandal were students who were from a Chinese background. But basically what happened was those two journalists discovered a data security vulnerability on this website that allowed them to uncover a tranche or a cache of documents relating to contract cheating transactions that had been taking place on this site. And that led me down a process of discovery, which has now allowed me to be able to explain to you the 5 main ways in which contract cheating provision is provided. And that definition that was provided at the start was a really fantastic one. It's really when students get someone else to do their work for them and then submit it to a university or indeed any educational institution as if it's their own work. And the 5 main sources I've listed here in what I believe to be size order. First of all, friends and family, parents, friends, girlfriend, boyfriend, mates, and what I'm going to put in inverted commas, friends, from my evidence, from my research, are the largest provider of contract cheating services. Now, I want us to come back and reflect on this at the end of this presentation and perhaps have a little bit of a conversation with ourselves about why we think that is and where we think that's happening and what we think it means. The second largest group that I was aware of, I think this has probably shifted a little bit in the last year or so, but academic custom writing companies were the dominant providers. And I think in some ways they probably still are. But this is really in an area that I would call two-sided markets, and then writing purchase sites or academic custom writing sites, coaching companies, and I would argue that the My Master company that was also associated with an outfit called Ying Credible is one of these coaching companies. And unfortunately, Ying Credible, the woman who was running the My Master company, who you saw on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, her name is Serena or Ying Ying Dao, is still running Ying Credible, and they have one of their so-called campuses just about, I don't know, a cricket ball's throw that way on Anzac Parade, just within almost a shadow's distance of UNSW. And there's another sort of model that we've uncovered and we're exploring, which we're really calling hives or nests, where a team of people work together to infiltrate courses at universities. There are also contract cheating transactions going in what I would call legitimate learning sites. I've got to put inverted commas around that word legitimate because some of them are sort of on the shady side of legitimacy. These would include discussion sites, tutoring sites, and file sharing sites. And these are really starting to prevail as a dominant source of contract cheating provision, particularly in the COVID world where so many exams are operating online. These transactions are also taking place on legitimate non-learning sites, completely legitimate sites like eBay, Airtasker, Upworks, Rent-A-Coder, but also on things like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, all of these sorts of places, transactions are also taking place. And finally, what we call a kind of macro side of the problem is having somebody else sit exams for you or undertake a whole course or even a whole program of study for you. I've heard tell of deals being done with students when they rent apartments in Sydney, that part of the rental offer is actually having their work done for them as well. Sitting amongst all of this is a kind of shadow industry, a sort of shadow scams, which is involving things like blackmail, and visa fraud and kidnapping scams. And these are sort of tangentially related to contract cheating industry as well, particularly the blackmail companies, where really the main source of their revenue is not the initial writing fee, but the blackmail that they can extract from people every month after that work has been submitted. And the fee goes up after graduation and when jobs are secured. So here's an example of probably one of my favourite contract cheating sites. It's called, I know I probably shouldn't have favourites, should I, Monica? But anyway, it's one of my favourites. It's called ISAA Shark. And it works a bit like eBay in the sense that you've got a bunch of writers and a bunch of clients who star rate each other. And the writers can also get awards. And we can see here the different range of topics that this writer called Blasey has done. Now, I actually don't think this is an individual called Blasey. This is actually a photograph of a gentleman called Liam, who I believe sings in a music band called One Direction. I bet the young people are listening to, I don't know. I think it's actually a consortium of different writers because of the volume that this particular writer generates. But we can see in those discipline areas that it's mostly business and management, English and literature, healthcare and life sciences. But if we scan to the bottom of that list, we can see that also this person has done 4 papers on aviation. And at this point, we might sort of start to feel a little bit anxious about the fact that we have people studying aviation who are getting somebody else to do their work for them. But the key thing I want to point out for you here is this number, which when I took this screenshot on the 7th of October 2018, that particular order was the 122,541,480th order that had been transacted by the ISAA Shark website. Now, back in 2018, that was a big number. And I used to pretty recently, like regularly, update that number. And the most up-to-date number I was able to get was 162,002,287 orders that were processed by ISAA Shark. But I'm not able to update that number anymore. And that's because if you go to ISAA Shark now on your computer, you'll get something that looks a bit like this, or more likely looks a bit like this. You can no longer access ISAA Shark from Australia. And you can actually see why when you appreciate that this happened. The Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency Amendment Prohibiting Academic Cheating Services Bill 2019, which passed through federal parliament last year, has effectively outlawed the provision of contract cheating services in Australia. And it's fantastic to have this federal legislation. You might sort of, for those of you who know enough about the Australian Constitution, will probably have already twigged to the fact that because it's Commonwealth legislation, it has limited scope in terms of what we can do or what it can do in terms of educational providers, because the good constitutional scholars amongst you will know that education is in the Residual Powers Act, in the Constitution, as a state's responsibility, not a federal Commonwealth responsibility. But this bill does do what it can do using constitutional powers to do with things like telecommunications and particularly to do with internet service provision and so forth. What this basically means is the feds, the federal police, as well as the federal government, is really paying attention to the supply side of the problem. The commercial providers, the advertisers, and the internet service providers. And we, as higher education providers, are continuing to take responsibility for the demand side of the problem under the Higher Education Standards Framework Threshold Standards legislation of 2015. This is our responsibility. So we look after the consumer side of the problem, the demand side of the problem, and the feds look after the supply side of the problem. But all of it is overseen by the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, who are supporting us, but also directing the federal police in their prosecutory powers. So this has been a game changer in Australia, and it has meant that companies like ISAA Shark have shuttered in Australia and are now no longer available. Similar legislation now exists in Ireland, in New Zealand, in 13 states in the United States, and most recently in South Africa. UK is currently putting a few bills through the House of Commons and the House of Lords to try to outlaw the provision of these services in the UK. And that's really shutting down access to these resources in these jurisdictions. Let me just get all of these out of my screen. Sorry, it's my day job intruding, I'm afraid. Sorry, everybody. Where am I? Let's go back to where we were. Sorry, everybody. I should have turned everything off, shouldn't I? Where am I? There we go. So can you say that again now, Monica? Yep, great. Now, I'm going to get back to ISAA Shark, and this is the kind of advice that ISAA Shark gives. And the thing that's really interesting about it is it's almost good. Let's have a look at this piece of advice. If you have a proper timetable, it will be easier to manage your deadlines. You can break up your day in order to make the process of completing your homework less challenging. But let's go to the final sentence. But if you feel like effectiveness is not your trait, and if you wonder, can I pay someone to do my assignment? There is a way out. It's using our service. So they put advice like this on their website to give a veneer of respectability and legitimacy to their services. This is the set of sites that I have found that I found particularly interesting. And I invite you, I can see a few of you on my screen, but I invite you to just have a look at these sites, and perhaps any of you that have your microphones on, you might want to volunteer what you're noticing about these sites. Any thoughts, anybody?
A sameness.
The sameness, yes, good observation. What do you think it is that makes them the same? What's driving that sameness, do you think?
Say when you're ready.
100% satisfaction.
Why do you think they look so similar, everybody? I mean, they clearly look similar, don't they? What do you think's driving that? Why are they
They're working together in teams.
Oh, they're working together. Rodney, good observation. I think you're getting close. Anybody else?
Made by the same person.
Christine, you might have seen this before. Were you cheating?
I was actually.
Yes, Christine's 100% right. What I was able to discover is that they were actually built by the same person. And here was my discovery process. I did notice they were remarkably similar to each other. And then I did some fancy trickery, and I found some other sites that were associated with those same websites. And I found these two sites. Now, well, these are just two examples, but when we look at these sites, it's very much aimed at the student client. You know, trust us, come to us, we'll do your work for you, 100% plagiarism free, order now, satisfaction guaranteed, money back in 14 days, we've got somebody on call, blah, blah, blah. But these sites were materially different. They were saying, come and work for us. We will pay you handsomely. We will give you good conditions. You can do some fantastic work on lots of different projects. You can work from home. I love this bit down here. I've got to read it all to you. This company has zero tolerance on plagiarism, and all writers are required to uphold high level of integrity, academic ethics, and professionalism while working on an order. So doesn't that reassure us all? Doesn't that reassure? But I realised that these sites were clearly facing the writers, and these sites were clearly facing the clients. And I still couldn't quite figure out how to join them together until I found these two sites. And these are what I call the master sites. These are places where you or I could go and pay these two gentlemen, one called Sam and one called Zach, around about $600 US to build a contract cheating company for us. And you might notice that the one on the right-hand side is actually the one that you can go to build those sites that I showed you previously. But what was interesting about these sites is that you can probably see here, they both had a live demo button that I could click. And I thought, okay, I will click on that and I will see what the demo shows me. And what I was able to do when I clicked on that demo was actually see the internal workings of the company. I could see the business processes and the workflows. My flatmate happens to be a business analyst, and over a bottle of wine and a quiche one night, I convinced him to work on it with me as a little project. Of course, we did all of the conflict of interest stuff that we were supposed to for ethics at UNSW. But what he was able to do was go into that website and reverse engineer the business model. And this is the basic structure that we were able to find. We call it the bear paw diagram, where we've got the basic master site, which is where the admin and the writers go to do the work that they need to do. And then branching off that are one or multiple client sites that basically give the market an illusion of choice. There are some that are definitely branded to the Australian, the American, and the British clientele. It also gave the clients a reassurance that it was somehow a local company. And then some of them were also specifically targeting to particular discipline areas like nursing or engineering. But we could tell that they were actually all the one company because they had shared phone numbers and shared PayPal addresses. My logic was that if the money was going into the same pocket and the phone number was ringing the same phone, then they were probably the same company. Some other things that we were able to demonstrate. Now, this is all very technical, but this is a business process diagram that my flatmate was able to generate for us. And what it shows is the workflow that is undertaken once the order is received right through to the order being completed. We were also able to find the different status levels that writers could attain, going from normal to silver to advanced. And what you should be able to see there, I don't expect you to take in the detail, but what you should be able to see there is that this is a pretty sophisticated business model that's at work. And this is really dating back to 2014. And what I was able to discern from this is that they were servicing a mature and large market. And this is, again, back in 2014. If anything, since then, it's only grown. What I've noticed in the years since is that contract cheating has really infiltrated the popular culture of our life. This novel, which I commend to you, Room for a Stranger, by Australian author Melanie Cheng, tells a really interesting story about an international student who's living with an older woman in a sort of house share room rental situation while he's studying at university, and he engages in contract cheating behaviour. There's also this fantastic Thai film called Bad Genius, which is an epic and exciting tale of a massive contract cheating exam scam. When we see The Devil Wears Prada as a great film, we know that Andy's really hit rock bottom when we come home to find that she's completing the twins' homework for their science project for them. Even Peppa Pig has had parents do her homework for her, which is another instance of contract cheating. One of the really interesting examples is a storyline that was pursued in the sitcom The Big Bang Theory. You might not be familiar with this, but basically all of the characters except Penny, who's in the bottom left there holding her mobile phone, are all esteemed scientists, mostly physicists, but also engineers and microbiologists and brain surgeons who are pursuing careers in science at a university and a pharmacy company. And basically, they're all very, very clever, but emotionally not so intelligent. And Penny on the left-hand corner has no higher education qualifications. And at one point, she undertakes a community college degree in the humanities, in history. Now, there are a lot of academic integrity storylines that are pursued in this particular sitcom, and always integrity prevails when it's science. But when Penny undertakes a history degree, her partner, Leonard, who's on the right-hand side of this image, starts to try and help her by doing her homework for her. She resists, but in the end, it's her two girlfriends, Bernadette and Amy, who do her homework for her. And there are no consequences for her, and integrity doesn't prevail. I argue because it's not science, it's the humanities. So contract cheating is a very normal part now of our popular culture and storylines that we might be familiar with seeing in shows like this. So what I want to do now in this part of the presentation is to just take you some of the key findings of my research. I've published 6 papers now on this topic, as well as two book chapters. But the main body of my research has come out of an Office of Learning and Teaching grant that was led by the late Tracy Brettag and Rowena Harper from the University of South Australia. And you can see our contract cheating and assessment design project logo, the Nautilus shell, in the top left-hand corner of these slides. We identified what we considered to be learning outsourcing behaviours, and we identified 7 of them. 2 of them we considered to be sharing behaviours, they're the 2 on the left. And 5 of them we considered to be cheating behaviours. And these are the ones that we were particularly interested in finding out more about. We did 2 big surveys. One, the biggest survey of its kind, of 14,000 students. And you can see the demographic breakdown of the student responses we got to that survey. And we also did a survey of over 1,100 staff, and you can again see the breakdown, the demographic breakdown of the academic respondents we got to that survey. Some of the key findings was that the proportion of students respondents who admitted to engaging in 1 or more contract cheating behaviours was 6%. Now you might think, well, that's quite small, but in a classroom of 100 students, that's 6 students. That to me feels really unacceptably large. The proportion of teaching staff respondents who admitted to engaging in 1 or more of these cheating behaviours when they were students was 10%. I found that particularly shocking. And that's how we were able to get to the estimate of 6 to 10% of students engaging in these behaviours. We had 4 respondents in the teaching staff who admitted to assisting students with contract cheating themselves, which I found very shocking. And there were 3 statistically significant correlations with contract cheating behaviour. The most significant was students whose first language is not English, but there was also statistically significant correlation with students who were generally dissatisfied with the teaching and learning environment, and those who saw lots of opportunities to cheat. Now, one of the key myths that we busted was that the attitudes of students with first language other than English towards contract cheating behaviours was not a factor. So I've often heard people say, oh, but in their culture, this is considered to be acceptable behaviour. That was something that we were able to bust that myth. It was the extra pressure of not having the language of instruction as your first language that seemed to be the more statistically significant factor. Now, these are some of the really interesting findings. We asked the 3 groups, the staff and then the students who we split out into the cheating group and the non-cheating group. We asked them how much of this they estimated was actually going on, and the academic staff got it about right, around about 6 to 10%. Very few of them thought it was more common than 50%. Interestingly, the non-cheating group was sort of a similar kind of shape, although they were less confident that it was in that lower end of the spectrum than the staff were. But the cheating group were much more likely to think it was much more common than it actually is. And we call this the Lance Armstrong effect, that perception that everybody else is doing it, therefore I should get that same competitive advantage by doing it myself. And this is something we see in a lot of antisocial, immoral, illicit behaviours, that people who do these or engage in these behaviours think it's much more common than it actually is. But this was the more concerning one for me. We asked the staff, the students, how concerned they were about the problem. And it's heartwarming to see that the staff were moderately to extremely concerned about this problem. It was really no surprise that the cheating group were almost the exact opposite. They were mostly, not at all, or only slightly concerned, and then very few were extremely concerned. But what was most shocking was where the non-cheating group fell. Their appreciation of this problem was almost exactly the same as the cheating group, which shows us that the students who aren't engaging in this behaviour don't think it's a big deal. They're not particularly concerned about it. And that's where I'm now putting a lot of my energies. How can we get the students who, the 90 to 94% of students who aren't doing this and would never do this, how can we get them to communicate to the students who are doing it that this is not okay and it's not as common as they think it is? So I want to return to that question I started with. Does it matter? And is it doing harm? And I want to also return us to these sources and environments of contract cheating, and particularly draw your attention to the orange box on the left-hand side and have a think about how and where the dominant area where students are sourcing this illicit support might be coming from. Families, friends, parents, girlfriends, boyfriends, grandparents assisting grandchildren with their primary, secondary, and even university study. So just something for us to ponder and reflect on as we move from the presentation now into a conversation.
Perhaps I should start. Hi, Cath. Opening the conversation with you. What a fascinating talk. What a broad field. So it seemed to me that over the next 15 minutes or so, there were 3 or so themes that we might pull out. And I guess the one that struck me first of all was the one that was beginning to emerge before you started talking, when you raised up your fountain pen, and Christine talked about the nib, and I thought about my pencil. I've always written with pencil, even when I was at university. And I was thinking that when I was a student, this level of cheating was impossible. This level, this type of cheating. Why? Because, well, we were in a very small cohort, but we wrote everything by hand. And not only did we write by hand to our academic staff, but they communicated to us, usually by hand. So a way that it worked for us was at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Can you imagine this happening in contemporary universities? 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, the academic whose week it was to set the assessment task would come down and pin it on the notice board, and we students would arrive like a swarm of bees to copy it down and go away, write it over the weekend, because it was due to be handed in physically on Monday at 12 o'clock. And what I saw as you were talking was that nobody who's involved in the kind of academic pursuits here would dream of writing with a pen or pencil on a piece of paper and setting it out, you know, name on the top, date, and so on and so forth. So, and that caused me to think about photocopying. When I was an undergraduate, photocopying didn't exist. We went to the library and we took our own notes. That meant that sharing notes was in and of itself extremely difficult, because it meant making multiple copies. So I wonder, Cath, whether you've got any observations on the impact of changing technologies. Not just, I guess I was also thinking about technologies of learning as well as technologies of communication.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make here, because of course, this kind of multinational industry, where it is now entirely plausible, Hilary, that a student from South Korea could be studying at a university in Sydney that goes to a website that is housed in Nairobi, Kenya, to employ somebody who's living in the Ukraine, who studied at a university in the UK, to do their work for them.
That's amazing. But,
that is
yeah.
Not just plausible, it's probably happened, you know, it's probably happening right now. So that, what's enabled that? Well, it's the software as a service, that platform that I showed you, that's, you know, Zach and Sam, these 2 chaps in Nairobi who build these sites for you. It's also things like PayPal, you know, being able to easily make a payment. While you're a South Korean student living in Sydney, you can pay in Australian dollars that gets turned into Kenyan shilling, you know, via PayPal without any of this kind of foreign currency to do. The fact that you've got a well enough educated but underemployed population of writers in a former British colonial nation like Kenya who are doing this as a side hustle to make a bit of extra money. The fact that they can produce a piece of work that's at a passable standard in a university course in Sydney, having never even been to Sydney, let alone in our classrooms. I mean, that technology is enabling all sorts of things, but it's also, as you say, the socio-cultural and political milieu of where we find ourselves in the 21st century, you know, with that kind of a population who are needing the services and the population who's able to provide it. So it's not just, as you say, it's not just the technology, it's also where people are and what people are able to do. But if we go back to the fountain pen and we go back to the pinning of the notice on the notice board, I have to say, if I was to do something like that now, I would be hauled in front of a complaints panel. Like, oh, look at his split. But you know, I remember doing my first year university papers on a typewriter. I moved to a computer and word processing in my second year, so I'm kind of in that turnover. But there was no internet back then, certainly no World Wide Web. But I would argue, Hilary, that this contract cheating behaviour is as old as education. You know, if you think about the very early years of Oxford, Cambridge, and Durham, you know, and a wealthy enough person at college getting somebody else to do their work for them and paying them either in money or in clothes or alcohol, or I mean, a lot of the horror stories I hear are people paying in sexual favours. You know, all sorts of horror stories there about international students also, you know, paying for accommodation with sexual favours. You know, that there's an economy of exchange here, an economy of favours that is as old as education. I would actually go so far, and Tricia Bertram-Gallant agrees with me on this, it's probably the oldest form of cheating behaviour there is. So yes, it's completely new. I mean, I would argue that this really started to boom in about 2014, 2015, which is really when this software as a service, PayPal, kind of perfect storm aligned. We see a similar boom operating in its sort of sister industry, which is the paper mills that are written as a part of a massive part of research misconduct, particularly in areas where, for instance, if you're a medical practitioner in a hospital, to maintain your role or to get promoted, in some jurisdictions in the world, you have to publish a certain amount of papers each year. These medical professionals, particularly in a pandemic, don't have time to do that. They pay somebody else to fraudulently produce fake research on your behalf. Very similar kind of business model emerged at a very similar time. So yes, the technology is there. Yes, Hilary, the technology is enabling things to happen in ways that you wouldn't have been able to imagine, or I wouldn't have been able to imagine when we were undergraduates. But in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? This is really a very old behaviour.